From the Lean Enterprise Institute in Boston, this is the WLEI Podcast, where we share stories of people making the world better through lean thinking and practice. For more information about LEI, including how we can help you apply lean thinking, please visit lean.org.
Hello, I'm Lex Schroeder, and my guest today on the WLEI podcast is Sarah Milstein. Sarah coaches executive and emerging leaders in tech. She's held executive roles at a number of tech startups and in the federal government. She was also CEO and co-founder of Lean Startup Productions. For this issue of the Design Brief, I'm delighted to chat with Sarah about what it means to put people first in lean product and process development and create a healthy work culture so that people can actually focus on working together more effectively toward real value creation. Hi, Sarah. I'm eager to chat with you about three things today: how work is changing, how organizations are organizing work and doing hiring and promotions these days, and how lean product and process development fits into this discussion. First, though, to bring our listeners up to speed, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work? People may know you as one of the organizers of the Lean Startup Conference in its early years, or as an engineering leader. I know you've held engineering leadership roles in both tech and media. But can you tell us about yourself and also kind of what brought you to lean and to lean product and process development?
Yeah. Well, I went to business school at Haas in a program where you worked while you were in school. And I took a class at one point about customer development. I think that was even in the title of the class. And in part because I was working at the time, it was immediately obvious to me that lots of the tech startups that I had been working for, the one I was working for at the time, were building things that nobody wanted to use or buy because nobody was talking to potential customers along the way. And so the idea of customer development and many of the other lean ideas really resonated with me very deeply. And I was able to apply them right away and then evangelize them about them a little bit because it felt to me so clear that people had missed that step in many of the tech startups that existed at the time. So I went on to lead engineering teams at a bunch of different startups. And a central idea of lean thinking that you need to create value as you build rather than backloading it and hoping for it at the end. That idea about sort of creating value along the way became a really central part of my engineering leadership, and how we think about how teams work and what their goals are, how we communicate with them. So these days I coach execs and emerging leaders mostly in tech.
Awesome. Thank you. I do feel like you brought us up to speed. I appreciate it. And I'm learning too, talking with you. So I appreciate this conversation. In this month's design brief, we're speaking with leaders about Jim Morgan's lean product and process development principle, put people first. Sounds really simple, but I think it's hard to do. Before we get to a larger conversation about industry changes and how to build a LPPD system with people at the center in the midst of these changes, I wonder if you can talk about what this principle, put people first, truly means to you. How have you approached creating cultures of respect, and what does it mean in practice?
Yeah. So, people, of course, can be both employees and customers, and sometimes it feels like putting those groups first, one or the other, can be at odds, with the other one. So it's not always straightforward. And I think sometimes people hear putting people first, especially employees, as making sure that they have the right perks or that there's hand-holding for their career development. But I don't think that's necessarily the right focus. I would say one of the primary ways that I've found to create a culture of respect as a leader is to communicate frequently on a regular schedule about strategy and what's informing it. That is like the bigger environment, what that looks like for our business decisions, what those decisions are, what's changed since the last time we talked about it, and how that's affecting our plans, what's going well and what's not. Thinking about that as a leadership team, um, communicating that stuff to the company, to the departments, to the individual teams. There's a lot of regular communication you need for people to understand those things, like what's informing our decisions, how have they changed, what's going well and what's not. And you also need a mechanism for employees to ask questions, raise concerns, and contribute ideas that you actually respond to. And when you have those things in place, you're communicating regularly, you're talking about what's changing, they're hearing how it affects them, and they have a chance to contribute and you're responding. You can really build an environment of trust and respect. And I think that that can undergird almost everything else you do and has, there's an investment in doing that communication. But it pays off hugely in many ways, including that you can move a lot faster. Because people do feel respected. They're not constantly questioning what's going on for them. They know where they are in the business. They know how to make decisions. They know why you're making decisions, even if those decisions have some trade-offs. People can understand those things.
Mm. Thank you for laying that all out so clearly. I recall, I want to talk more about this value creation piece. I recall a piece you wrote on Lead Dev about your time at Daily, the software company Daily, that wasn't about lean product development per se, but it was a really great blog about how to keep the focus on value creation and how you design things at Daily in terms of job roles and salaries to allow for this. I'm just going to quote you because this kind of stuck with me rather. You wrote, in a system where levels, salaries, raises, and promotions have to be negotiated, managers spend an enormous amount of time working them out. With our approach, managers avoid all of that and can instead focus on high value work like supporting teams and addressing customer needs. End quote. What a thought. Can you tell us more about what exactly you did at Daily to kind of keep the focus on value creation, simplify roles and salaries and promotions, and the difference that it made? How did this help engineers and other folks focusing on meeting customer needs in reality?
Yeah. So when we raised our Series B, we had about 50 employees at the time, and the money gave us the room to hire a lot more. And at that point, we realized that a traditional structure where you negotiate salary with each new employee and you have managers who have to assess people's promotions and raises, that wasn't going to work for us. We didn't have enough managers for that. We knew from our previous experiences that managers can spend like 30 to 50% of their time on things like promotions. We didn't have time for that. We were still building the product and really finding product market fit. And we didn't have time for all of that company infrastructure building that comes with a more traditional system of promotions levels, where you have like a levels document, a ladders document, and that which takes forever to create promotions, where people have to create promotion packets and they have to be reviewed, and you need to do budgeting for salaries. It was really like we just didn't have the room for that. So we needed a structure that kind of ran itself. And what we did was we created 7 employee levels, each based on years of relevant experience. So rather than demonstrating that you were kind of working at a senior engineer level or staff engineer level, it was just based on years of relevant experience before you got to Daily. Each level had one salary, and we pegged those levels, the salary levels, to, I think it was P50 or just above P50 for companies at a similar stage in the San Francisco market at the time. We had a comp consultant who helped us figure that out so we could be competitive with our peers. Employees, everybody was assigned a level kind of based on their experience, and that included at that point experience at Daily for the existing employees. And then employees automatically bumped up to the next level by gaining experience at Daily. So instead of having to like advocate for a promotion based on accomplishments, twice a year we looked at whether people had gained enough more experience to advance to the next level. And there were a bunch of really good benefits to this for a company of our size. So first of all, this wasn't, we didn't even realize this one at the time, but it meant that the budget was really predictable for employees. And we could even tell people in January of 2027 is when you'll bump up to the next level. It created a really strong sense of fairness because we'd really reduced the surface area for bias, I would say. The biggest area of bias in this system is what we consider relevant experience for a role and how we looked at that for an individual employee. It really fostered a culture of collaboration instead of competition because you're not being measured on your output in terms of your promotions. People could help each other, that you could spend your time helping each other. It gave everybody an ability to focus on customer needs instead of promotion packets. Like, no, you just didn't have to think about it. Employees don't have to think about it. Managers didn't have to think about it. And I think that really meant that we could focus on customers in a very unusual way. I would say, a system like this is not without some trade-offs, but it also means that you can divorce promotions from career progression and from performance. So it's not that we didn't care about performance. People still got feedback. And in fact, one of the things that a system like this requires is that because people will automatically level up, you have to be willing to give people hard feedback to have them stay around, or be willing to let people go if they're not going to really be able to perform at the next level. Um, that's incumbent on the managers in the system, but it doesn't require spending all of your time um, assessing whether people are fitting into relatively arbitrary or politicized categories.
I'm curious, did other companies start to kind of mimic what you were doing at Daily? Did it spread? Did people kind of catch on?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We did learn of a couple of other companies who had like organically come up with similar kinds of things. And we certainly talked to a bunch of companies who considered things like this. I think there's kind of two big barriers to it. One is a lot of people like the power of being able to decide whether someone's going to be promoted or not. And that's something you have to give up with this system. And not everyone is like ready to do that or suited to doing that. And the other thing is there is an investment up front. You have to figure out the levels and the salaries that are appropriate for your company. You have to retrofit people into it. And that does take some amount of time. And some of the folks that we talked to really were looking at whether they could invest that time. And I don't know actually if people were just curious about what we were doing, and we talked to lots of people who were considering a system, but I don't actually know if they did wind up making the
Went for it.
investments. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Setting things up this way, I imagine, just like you said, freed people up to think more deeply about the work, to focus on learning, focus on meeting customer needs. I want to talk about learning specifically if we can. In the lean product and process development world, again, kind of referencing Jim Morgan's six principles, one of those is, building in learning and knowledge reuse, not just with engineering teams, but of course, particularly with people kind of closest to the value creating work. Can you tell me more about how you set teams of engineers up for true continuous learning and how you advise leaders these days in tech on this challenge?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think about this on a couple levels. So one is just an individual team level. You're a group of like 5 to 10 people, or these days sometimes teams are a little bigger than that, but a group that is working closely and meeting regularly. And when you have regular meetings that are weekly, biweekly, monthly, or on a sprint cycle of some kind, you can bake in a regular check-in point where everybody talks about something they've learned since the last meeting, in the last week, in the last month, in the last sprint. And part of that could be anything that they've learned that they want to share, but part of what that does is it keeps the focus in that group on learning, and sometimes reminds the group about things that you learned earlier that you can bring back into current work. So it just sort of keeps things at the surface. I think that's one of the hardest things, is to remember what you've learned. And that's so when you're on a project basis, an important thing to do is take notes about what you learned as a team, and go back and look at those at appropriate points in time. I mean, a good example of that in the world today, this is not a work example, but I think it's easy for people to understand. If you host a big Thanksgiving every year and you take notes at the end of the Thanksgiving weekend about what worked and what didn't, you want to remember to go back to that in mid-November
Yeah.
when you're planning the next big Thanksgiving. And sort of getting in the habit of doing both of those things, taking the notes and looking at them before the next project cycle, that's sort of at a project level. And then I think there's also, again, at the culture of learning kind of question, where it's just on people's minds, you can encourage people to teach each other things that they're learning at work, things that they happen to know. So that can be at, all hands or department all hands meetings. That could be at brown bags. You can do the occasional internal conference where, everybody spends a day or a half a day learning and teaching each other things. And that sort of encouragement and creating containers for people to teach each other. And often you have to encourage people to do it because they don't necessarily think, oh, I know a thing that other people could learn from. Sometimes there's a little bit of not just the structure, but the encouragement to get people to teach. But doing those things can create just an environment where people are paying attention to what they're learning and sharing that with other people. And I think those things can go a long way toward the knowledge reuse.
Thank you. Okay, let's zoom out for a moment. This is definitely a question as I followed your work over the years that I kind of wanted to ask you. I'm just curious how you're making sense of things right now with what's happening in tech. You know, what are some of the things that you're seeing that are changing that will stick from your view, and what are some things that perhaps are trends that will pass? I always wonder, I kind of came up in nonprofits and think tanks and then went into tech because of the, lean work that I do. And I'm sort of always struggling with the question, how do organizations build lean muscle at all with so much attrition and with so many rounds of layoffs? How do you kind of, again, build organizational muscle, build problem solving muscle? And we're also at this crazy unique moment in tech right now. I think about, middle layers of managers being hugely laid off. I'm curious what you're seeing, and given what you're seeing, what do you think is necessary to build lean and truly strong, sustainable product and process development systems? That's a heck of a question, but what's
Yeah.
what's changing, what's passing, what's trendy, what's not, and how do we do this with all of those industry changes?
Well, one thing I've thought about a lot recently is it feels to everybody right now that there's a lot of chaos in tech because there's a lot of layoffs and a lot of uncertainty in the economy and in the markets generally. But it is also the case that when the economy is steady and strong and there's a lot of hiring going on, there's also a lot of chaos on teams. And it's just, you're getting new people in, you don't know who they are, they're turning over a lot, there's reorgs constantly. It's sort of I think a condition, especially in the tech industry, of like chaos on teams. That's, I think, part of it's both conditional and cultural. And I think that means that it's not just the moment we're in, but there's a sort of a bigger constant question of how do we build kind of lean muscles no matter the macro environment. And I don't want to be a broken record on this, but I think one of the key ideas in a lean approach is building for value. And that means employees have to know what value is for your business. And that's typically, I would say, typically they don't know. Not that they're dumb, they're just not informed. And it changes all the time. And the things that leaders are thinking about are informed by a lot of inputs that are not available to employees. Of course, the opposite is true too. Employees have inputs that aren't available to leaders. That's why you need that two-way communication system. But I think leaders often underestimate the amount of information that their employees already have. So, really, one of the best things you can do in a chaotic environment is to communicate often, early and often, about what the business priorities are and what's informing them. What's the strategy, but then specifically, what are the priorities? And your messaging needs to change and your mechanisms need to change based on the stage of the company. And that's particularly relevant in a time like this where the company might be contracting and you need to change based on that. In other times, it might be relevant because the company is expanding. But I would say that the things that will probably resonate with all leaders is that when you have had a startup group and you start to have some regular customers, you're getting some traction, and you have a product that was built by people who were early stage companies, early stage employees rather, and now you're kind of getting into a more steady phase. Those employees often want to ship stuff that's not ready for customers. And that doesn't start to feel relevant or appropriate for the customers that you do have. And they just want to move fast and break stuff. Conversely, an equally difficult problem is when you have employees who either have come from or your company has come from a place of steadiness and you're trying to build something new, they want to overbuild. They want to make sure that all of the edge cases and corner cases have been accounted for. And in either case, you have people who are not building appropriately. Now, sometimes that is like personality. Some people are not well suited to different stages of a company. And as leaders, you have to kind of figure out, do we have the right people? But some of it is you understanding what's appropriate at your stage and then communicating about that, really helping them understand why things are different for the stage that you're in, why this chaos is different from the last kind of chaos that we had, and what we need to do on a tactical level to adjust. And that takes a fair amount of work for employees who are moving in one mode, who are moving in a startup mode to really like shift gears, or who were really in a legacy product environment to shift again like that. It's not easy and it's not intuitive. And I think that's a kind of investment that leaders can make in uncertain times of really understanding what is the environment and stage we're in, and then guiding employees appropriately for where you are.
Yeah, and how do we, what does designing the value stream actually mean now in this context? I also love
Yeah.
what you said about like Sure, it's a chaotic time, but kind of when isn't it? It's a different kind of chaos when the economy is, you know, doing well and things aren't quite so chaotic in the world. So I appreciate that view. It certainly kind of makes sense for what we talk about in the lean world. Like we're just working within complex adaptive systems, right? It's always chaotic. How do we create order out of chaos?
Yeah.
Um, so last question, and then I want to hear any thoughts that you have on this topic, but kind of related to how things are changing, um, how people are responding to that. Where do you see individuals? We've talked a lot about organizations and teams, but where do you see individuals struggling in particular right now, given some of the larger things that are happening? And what are things that you think leaders can do to help support their people better?
Yeah. So, I mean, with a lot of layoffs and the need for companies to really deliver in an uncertain economy, there's just a ton of pressure on individuals, often to do like a couple of jobs at once. And that's almost certainly going to backfire for the individuals, like they'll burn out, and for the company. You'll make unforced and costly errors because nobody has the time to kind of look up and look around. And there's many ways, of course, you can make errors when people are overpressured. So you really, the only way out of that is to prioritize. And that's at a company level and at a manager level and at an individual level. And so I think the things that I advise leaders to do is to work on that at several levels. So that's helping, again, helping employees understand the business priorities and when they change. And that means that the business can't have 12 priorities. There's like the impulse to have a slide that has like, here's our top three priorities, but also here's our other eight priorities and the other three mini prior, like it is, that's a strong impulse and it does not work. People can't make sense of that. And it means you're really not doing the work of deciding what's most important to us and what trade-offs can we accept here. So at a leadership level, being able to think for the company, what are we prioritizing and what are we deprioritizing, and communicating about that with employees and why. Why are these the important things? Why have these things become less important?
Mhm.
Even things that we held very dear. Why are we changing course? So that's company level. And then there's sort of an active discussion in all hands meetings, in department meetings, in team meetings, um, about what you're not going to do anymore. Like, what does it mean to prioritize? That means you're accepting some trade-offs. So, what are you not going to do anymore at all? What are you doing on a slower timeline? How much slower? What are you doing to a lesser or a worse degree? What are you individually or as a team delegating somewhere else? Those are all important discussions to have. Those are the tactics of how do we prioritize? And that might raise questions that are really worth collaborating on and discussing together. And then I think at a individual level, when you meet with employees as a leader, you can model some of that. You tell them what you're doing individually, but also you ask them to show up and talk to you about what they're prioritizing, how they took in this information, what they're prioritizing. You come to collaborate with them and make sure that they're in the right place, but also you come ready to accept some trade-offs. Now, they may not have the right trade-offs in mind. They may not have the right information to make the right trade-offs. You may need to get somewhere together, but part of what you do as an individual manager is help your employees understand what are the appropriate trade-offs to make.
Mhm.
And it's not a matter of just showing up and saying you have to do more with less. It's
Yeah.
really a matter of kind of together figuring out what's right for the business in this environment.
Well said. I like the focus on kind of like asking the right questions, like being in the right dialogue around what actually is priority. Well, I learned a lot. I'm really grateful for your time. I'm curious, before we close, is there anything you would add on this theme? Again, it's super broad. What does it mean to put people first in this moment? But is there anything we haven't talked about that you'd share?
No, I mean, I think you ask great questions. I would just say to your listeners, more communication than you ever thought was possible
Yeah.
is actually the key to moving faster and moving with more trust and respect with your employees. And it's a little counterintuitive to think about how much time you put into the communication up front, but it pays off in huge dividends.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you, Lex.